When you see something as ubiquitous as the decline of untold numbers of people as they age, it would be very easy and tempting to say that that is the inevitability of our species. Death is inevitable, despite what some biohackers may tell you. Decline is inevitable, but the rate of decline is very much up to us, and the preservation of strength, stamina, movement capacity, those things are largely up to us. In fact, there are actual data that demonstrate quite clearly. In fact, I was just reading a paper yesterday in the journal Cell that looked at the role of exercise in aging individuals to preserve mitochondrial function. So this is a study that looked at older individuals, and it randomized one group to a significant amount of exercise, and the other group was just sort of business as usual, being largely sedentary. And then using pretty elaborate techniques where you biopsy the muscle, they look at the mitochondria, which are the kind of the powerhouse of the cell in these individuals. And it turned out that in the people who were exercising, there was very little decline in the mitochondrial function compared to what happened in the people who were not exercising. Now, just because your mitochondria continue to function well doesn't mean all aspects of aging are offset, but it's a very important one to demonstrate. And this is also true, by the way, of strength and endurance. There's a big difference in the rate of decline of muscle mass, muscle strength, and cardiopulmonary fitness in people who exercise versus who don't. So it's all kind of a long-winded way of saying you have, as an individual, so much more under your control than you realize, but you have to sort of begin to compounding the gains.
I'll do it when I'm 50.
Well, look, the good news is 50 isn't too old, and I've met many people who don't begin to do this until they're 50. But again, the analogy I would use here is comparable to that of investing for retirement. The longer you wait, the less money you're probably going to have at the end.
Springs to mind this graph I saw the other day, which I'd sent to my friends, which shows that the decline, I think it was in muscle mass from when you're 30, and it makes the point that there's this line which on this graph called disability, and it shows that people who didn't have enough muscle mass when they were 30 cross the line of disability when they're 70, and those that did have more muscle mass at 30 don't get close to that line. So that for me was shocking, because it goes to show that what I do now is going to determine whether I'm, by all intents and measures, disabled when I'm 70 or if I'm able.
The sooner you start, the better. The drawback that young people have is, you've had a great experience because you're introspective about it and you've been able to observe it in somebody older. So you've been able to gather motivation without having to experience the decline yourself. So that's a wonderful position to be in. For many people, that's not the case. They only begin to realize the inevitability of the decline when it besets them. But the way to think about this, again, as another analogy, is that of a glider. So gliders eventually all have to come down, right? Our health span is basically a glider, but we have a lot of control about how long it stays in the air based on how high we can start it. So if you think about, would you rather take a glider off a really high cliff or off a low cliff? That's the decision we get to make. And we sort of call that concept physiologic headroom. So the example you gave is a great one, right? So muscle mass, muscle strength provide an enormous amount of physiologic headroom, as does cardiopulmonary fitness. These are huge variables that make all the difference. And everyone's coming down, but the fitter you are, the slower the rate of decline, and therefore the longer it takes before you cross below a threshold. And that threshold differs by different metrics, but once you're below that threshold, it's very difficult to engage in activities of enjoyment.